about the update in their 2023 decarbonization study. But before I turn the wheel over to Jennifer, I just want to remind folks about how we operate on our webinar series. We ask you to keep your microphones muted just so that we can minimize any background noise. We ask you to use the chat function to ask your questions, and I'm monitoring it the whole time. So feel free to do so because I'll be watching it, and I'll wait for Jennifer to take a breath before I break in. But when she does pause for a moment, I'll ask her your question as quickly as I can. We do encourage questions, and our speakers appreciate them. So please do use that chat box and use it liberally. So as questions come up, we are recording this, and you can watch a recording or forward a recording of this webinar and our other webinars by going to our YouTube channel. You'll see that that URL down there. And if you like, I think we're okay to share your slide deck. Is that right, Jennifer? Once this is over, just send Judy a note and she'll send it out if you're interested in having a PDF copy of the slide deck. We're also looking forward to our next webinar in July, assessing the value of natural gas storage, an analysis done by the American Gas Association. That should be really interesting, especially given that we have actually a number of storage facilities, but 2 underground storage facilities right in our market that make a big difference for our region with regard to energy reliability and resilience. So it'll be an interesting webinar. We're off in August because a lot of people are at the lake or elsewhere. So we try to give you a month off, and then we'll be back in September, and we'll announce that probably in our next webinar series. So again, just keep your microphones muted, ask your questions in the chat box. You could go back to see a recording of this. And if you would like slides, let Judy know and we'll get you the slides. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, Jennifer, and turn the wheel over to you. Thank you again for joining us today and giving us this important information.
Okay, let me get this. There we go.
Yeah, it worked.
Perfect. Ooh, first time. So yeah, good afternoon. Jennifer Colson. I'm from Puget Sound Energy, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you our work from 2023. This is really focused on a decarbonization study that we produced and filed with the Washington Utility Transportation Commission in December of 2023. And the reasoning and the background for why and how this decarbonization study came about was actually a settlement agreement from our 2022 general rate case. And it's commonly referred to as stipulation O, as you can see on this screen. I bring it up just for reference because the decarbonization study was actually one component of that settlement agreement. The other components that I may reference when I'm speaking to the study is the targeted electrification pilot and the targeted electrification strategy. If you're familiar with the legislation in Washington State, we had a decarbonization bill, HB 5089, that passed in April of 2024, which was after the study was completed, but before the filing of the full stipulation O work. So as Dan mentioned, happy to make this available. It's also available through the UTC website, which may not be entirely easy to navigate to. So happy to share the full slide deck if you would like as well. So let me see if I can change the slide. There we go. So I'm going to walk through an overview of the study, how we approached it from, a methodology, a perspective, the results, and our key takeaways. Okay. Before I dive into much, I think it's helpful to orient everyone if you're not familiar with Puget Sound Energy. So we are a Washington State-based utility that is gas and electric. We have about 1.24 million electric customers and 881,000 gas customers. This data here is from 2023 when this study was conducted, so you can see the fuel mix on your screen. I wanted to bring up this slide mainly for the graph on the right-hand side of your screen regarding our service territory. So this will become important as I talk through the results. You can see that I mentioned we're a gas and electric utility, but we don't have overlapping territories 100% of the time. So about 50% of our gas utility overlaps with our electric, which can be shown in the orange. The purple is our gas only service areas. And I bring this up because when I talk about the cost of building electrification, we're not incorporating those electric utilities in our gas only service territory, such as Tacoma or Seattle City Light. This is purely looking at PSE's costs. And then there's also the electric only service areas in this lighter color. And those costs of a gas customer converting from those utilities are incorporated from the electric side for PSE's, from PSE's perspective. Okay, go to the next one. So before I dive into the essentially executive summary of this report, I'm going to give you the key findings so you know what to look out for. The reason we're talking about this study today, even though it's a couple of years old and there has been a number of changes since then, is it is really the foundation and the framework for how PSE is approaching our first integrated system plan. As Dan mentioned, that will be filed April 1st of 2027, and that is currently well on its way of progress and being in progress. We are also working on our targeted electrification phase 2 pilot. The pilot, as I mentioned, in the phase 1 work was part of the stipulation O agreement. And since then, we've gained approval to continue that pilot process. And we're in the process of getting that stood up again. The findings from this study, as I go through this information, you'll see that the emissions from the gas and electric utility combined actually do increase in the near term until more renewables in the region are brought onto the system. And I'll talk about all these things more, don't worry. The cost of reducing emissions is greater than the benefit to society. The average residential cost actually is similar across all of the scenarios that I'll walk you through in a moment, which is really interesting. And another interesting thing was we looked at it from a low-income customer's perspective as well. And in the near term, within the 2030 timeframe, their costs actually increased to electrify earlier than they did if they electrified later, which I'll show you. There are additional benefits for targeted electrification on certain parts of the gas system that we're going to continue to evaluate. As I mentioned, HB 1589 came into play about halfway through the development of that targeted electrification strategy. And because of that, there was a lot of opportunities to really push that evaluation into our first integrated system planning work. So we're excited to continue to evaluate that. So the overview, as I mentioned, this was a part of the stipulation O agreement. It had some pretty specific language regarding what was to be included in this analysis in this study. And it really did focus a lot on the value of the cold climate heat pump technology on our system. The thought was, the cold climate heat pump in theory reduces the peak on the electric system demand, therefore reducing the infrastructure costs, and would provide a better solution for Puget Sound Energy, because at the time we had only evaluated the impacts of a standard heat pump. Also in this study, you'll see that the scenarios I have across the screen are really just end-use heat pump technologies. And this is because, again, the language of the stipulation really focused on those items. But I'll say that across all of these scenarios, we're really focused on the heating end uses. However, we do electrify other end uses as well, but all end uses within a home are electrified based on the appliance burnout rate. So we're not electrifying a whole home all at once, meaning my furnace could die in 2 years, and then my hot water heater could die 3 years after that. And the analysis is evaluating electrifying each one of those at those points in time and not all at the same time. And the significance of the scenarios is really articulating how we're going from a gas furnace to an electric heating technology based on the scenario on the screen. And I'll describe them a bit more in a moment. And I should also mention, it's not just placed on burnout, it's also considering customers' willingness to transition to an all-electric piece of equipment for that specific appliance at some point in time as well. So in 2023, in our gas integrated resource plan, our consultant Cadmus Group did a survey to our customers regarding their willingness to transfer from a gas appliance to an electric. And as you can imagine, there's a bit of a curve regarding people's willingness to do that over time and as technologies increased. So the heating components actually do hit 100% adoption for electric by the end of the study period, which was 2045. However, things like cooking, I think it was around 30% of adoption by the end of the study period, which comes into play when we talk about reduction of costs on the gas system, as you can imagine. So at the end of the study period, we actually have roughly 50% of our gas customers still remaining on the gas system, even with this burnout and adoption rate across the board. And you'll see those filter through the results. Okay, so the scenarios again across the top of your screen. So we're electrifying customers based on equipment failure, and we're looking at all pieces of equipment, fireplaces, hot water heaters, cooking, etc., based on when they die, but also based on customers' willingness to adopt them over time. So in each study year, technically a customer could still opt to replace their gas equipment with a piece of gas equipment, and I'll show you those impacts from a customer perspective a little bit later. But within each scenario, I'm really focused on the different heating technologies. So scenario one is focused on replacing that gas furnace with an air source heat pump, a standard heat pump. All of these scenarios incorporate the Climate Commitment Act, and they also incorporate the Inflation Reduction Act on the demand side resources. So at the time of this study, the rules for the Inflation Reduction Act were not done yet. And as part of the requirement, we had to incorporate those impacts into this analysis. So we had Cadmus estimate what they thought based on historical programs and funding, how those savings would trickle down into the demand side resources and provide credits essentially on the electric heating equipment. So that's been incorporated across all these scenarios as well. So as we move to scenario two, it's doing the same thing, burnout, market willingness to transition, right? CCA, Inflation Reduction Act, but it's changing from a gas furnace to a cold climate heat pump. In scenario three, we're talking about hybrid heat pumps. And when I talk about a hybrid heat pump, I'm referring to a gas furnace with an electric heat pump backup and cooling. And this is converting existing gas customers and new customers based on the burnout rate again. Scenario four is looking at hybrid heat pumps for existing gas customers and electrifying new customers with a cool climate heat pump. PSE didn't do this by ourselves. We had some consulting support along the way. So as I mentioned Cadmus Group a little bit regarding their customer survey about customers' willingness to transition to electric equipment. So we incorporated that from the 23 gas IRP, but we also use them for those high-level Inflation Reduction Act assumptions and how that may flow into this work. We also use them because they develop our conservation potential assessment. So they produced the updated load shapes for each of these scenarios based on the equipment turnover. They also included conservation for each of these scenarios. We had the performance of the cold climate heat pumps incorporated as well. So cold climate heat pumps at the time of this study weren't really well known regarding their impact in the Pacific Northwest. We have quite a bit of a milder climate. It doesn't get that cold. So as part of this scope of work, they did an analysis on it and created a memo regarding how cold climate heat pumps actually interacted in our service area. We also worked with E3. Part of this requirement, stipulation O requirement, was to evaluate the impacts of electrification in the region in our analysis as well. So we had E3 do that assessment, which then really boiled down to updated resource costs and supply curves for, if there's a lot of demand for renewables in the Pacific Northwest and everyone's hitting CETA, all those sorts of things. They also incorporated Inflation Reduction Act assumptions. At the time, there were pretty generous assumptions regarding a reduction on green hydrogen that were incorporated in this analysis, and that included that Inflation Reduction Act. All of this information flowed into PSE's resource and system planning models, and we used all that information to develop essentially a view of what it would cost the utility, but also a view of what an average residential's heating bill would look like and how it would vary by scenario.
Jennifer, I'm just going to pop in here while you're taking a breath and just remind people if they have questions, please pose them in the chat. And yeah, it's good stuff. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. There we go. For those of us that may be more in tune with some of like an integrated resource planning process, the slide is a little helpful just to show how all these different inputs flowed through the analysis. So on the top left, you can see that's PSE service territory. And again, this is really PSE's responsibility areas. So our gas only, we did not include those electric utilities in this analysis. That was produced by Cadmus. Those flowed into all 4 of our planning models that you can see on the screen. On the bottom left, that's the Pacific Northwest, that regional electrification view. Again, that came from E3, and that was incorporated really at the supply side for the gas and electric portfolio. It's also worth noting the gas and electric portfolio models, which are your integrated resource plan. We're leveraging the 23 gas integrated resource plan and the 23 electric progress report. This is important just because the assumptions that were used in those filings are the same ones. We're just changing these components that I'm calling out specifically. So if you happen to follow that closely, you would know there's various assumptions there. And the outputs is a volume of infrastructure and investment and fuel supply and emissions across the board. And again, we were able to pull this together into like a utility cost view, but also look at the customer bill impact from a heating perspective. Now into the fun stuff, the results. So this is the NPV of the total net incremental cost for gas and electric. Each bar is representative of the scenarios. So the far left is that standard heat pump. The second one is the cold climate heat pump scenario. The third is the hybrid heat pump. And the fourth is the hybrid heat pump for the existing gas customers and cold climate for the new. You can see there's a 0 there and there's a negative. So the negative costs are the reduction of the gas supply and the gas T&D. And then the increase are the electric supply, the electric T&D, and then we also have the appliance and installation costs reflected. You can see scenario 2 is the highest cost, a lot of that being driven by the appliance costs. So there is a premium to a cold climate heat pump. You can see that there's a bit of a reduction on the electric system from the utilities perspective, but there is quite an adder from the customer's perspective regarding those appliances. And then what's interesting, I suppose, is that scenario 1 and 3 are pretty close. This is a 20-year plan, right? So we're making up a lot of things for the future regarding how things may end up. So that's an interesting component that they really kind of came out to be roughly very similar. And the cheapest one was scenario 4, leveraging that hybrid and the cold climate together. This is a similar graph, just kind of another view. So this time it's a kind of a incremental cost versus incremental benefit. So you can see the 0 axis, and the benefit is that reduction on the gas system, but we've also incorporated the social costs of greenhouse gas savings on there. So that's a societal benefit of reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. And then below the 0 is the additional costs on the electric side. So again, just a little different perspective, but it doesn't hurt to see data in a few different ways. Scenario 2 is obviously still the highest one, with scenario 4 still being the lowest, which would make sense. So it's another way to look at it.
So Jennifer,
Yeah.
I actually have a question if it's okay. If you,
Of
yeah, that's the slide. So can you give me a relative or us a relative sense of the number of housing units? So in scenario four, it's a hybrid heat pump in existing buildings and cold climate heat pumps in new buildings. And uh, so, how many new buildings are we talking about versus how many conversions of existing buildings are we talking? Do you have that kind of granularity?
I think we do. I just don't have it handy at the
Right.
moment. Yeah, the growth rate, right? It'd be the growth rate on the gas is, I don't know, typically 1% annually, so it's not terribly huge. I do know, the existing customers by the 2045 period, still half of them would likely still have some gas equipment in their home anyway,
Right.
even with the conversion, not converting all the way.
And then I do have another question on slide nine, then, which is just to confirm the costs on slide nine are for Puget Sound Energy's electric territories. Is that correct?
That's correct. So
Okay.
all of PSC's electric. This does not include Tacoma or Seattle or anyone else.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So now it's into the emissions, and this is where it also gets interesting as we look at this. So all of this is gas and electric, so the gas utility and the electric utility combined. Each line is representing a different scenario, and the dark dash line is the 23 electric progress report and the 23 gas IRP. The 23 work that I'm referencing did not include electrification. All of these plans assume that the company builds to meet the CETA requirements, and it also incorporates climate change if you're interested as well. So when you look at this graph, it's interesting because the lines are really close together, even in the reference case in the near term, which is kind of back to that key takeaway that I mentioned at the beginning. And you can see that kind of delta start occurring in the latter half of the plan around 2035. But what I find still interesting as well is that down to 2045, there's definitely a delta between the reference and these scenarios. However, the scenarios are still kind of pretty close together when you consider that, again, we're making up a lot of expectations regarding what the future will look like. And so those are relatively close together from an emission reduction perspective, which is an interesting consideration as well. And to remind everyone that, there is still 50% of the gas utility operating in 2045. So that's part of that emission there. And then there's also market purchases at the end there that are incorporated in keeping it up above the line there.
So also just a note here, I note that your y-axis doesn't start at, or does it start at zero? I guess it does start at zero, right? So that's,
Yeah, but it
yeah, good.
jumps.
Okay, I
It
got you.
jumps pretty big. Yeah. So 2000. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. I'm shocked. I usually get questions about this one. So maybe look.
That'll come later when you got to
Yeah.
type them into the chat, right?
Oh,
So,
it's too much for, yeah, it's a lot different there. Okay. So I think this is the most interesting aha moment for us. We hadn't ever really taken it through to a customer bill. So we found this to be a really helpful exercise. So this is looking at 2030, and it's a little complicated. So I'm going to step you through it. And then the rest of my graphs hopefully are just make total sense to you. Probably not, but that's okay. So these are in 2030 dollars. Each bucket of little columns there are for every scenario. So you can see the first one is in reference to the air source heat pump. Then you have the cold climate, hybrid, and the hybrid in the cold climate. And then on the far right, you have the reference case, which is that 23 work that I mentioned that does not include electrification, but does include CETA. So in each of these scenarios, as I was alluding to earlier, we're looking at burnout rate of appliances, and we're replacing appliance by appliance, not whole homes. But we're also considering customers' willingness to transition over time based on those appliances. So in 2030, as a customer, you could technically still purchase a gas furnace if your gas furnace died. So that's what we're trying to illustrate here is that there is customer choice in these scenarios. And so in 2030, if I'm a gas customer and I have a gas furnace and it dies, I could choose to replace it with a gas furnace, or I can convert to the heat pump of the scenario, if that makes sense. So on the left-hand side, that's what you're seeing. So for each section, so that what I just plopped on the screen is the annual average residential customer heating bill on the electric side. So in 2030, if a gas customer converted to the heat pump of that scenario, this would be their heating electric bill. So you got $959 in this first scenario. Now, in the same year, if a customer had a gas furnace and transitioned to a new gas furnace, their bill for heating would be $840. However, you also have to add in the CCA, so that just plopped up on the screen. So now just looking at the bill itself, you can see that the gas in these scenarios is slightly higher than the conversion to the electric heating end use across the board. I think what's also really interesting is if you go to the far right on the reference case, you kind of see the same setup, which is interesting because there's no electrification there, right? Now, if we add in the cost of the furnace, so say you finance your furnace for 10 years at a low, assuming you have great credit, you got the lowest score. I don't recall the exact finance percentage we used, but back in 23, it was much lower. So you can see that across the board here. There are no incentives or Inflation Reduction Act on the furnace, right? And then on the left, you can see that's the cost of the heat pump financed. And then there's the totals. So when you include the cost of the appliance conversion, then you really start seeing those deltas between the gas and electric. So in 2030, if a customer was looking for a price signal and weighing the total investment of the equipment plus the energy usage, they may not opt to transition because of cost, if that helps and makes sense.
So I'm gonna again wait. I'm the only one asking questions. Come on, people, type them in here. But I'm just curious, Jennifer, without having to go way deep into the weeds here, how you so the energy cost, the first part of your columns is energy delivered, commodity plus delivery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
So I'm just curious how you're accommodating uh, costs going forward on both sides of the system. So how are we accommodating, is there commodity costs being calculated in here, the cost of transmission and distribution on both sides? I mean, I assume this is not a flat number. You have some way of kind of forecasting that out. I'm just, again, without getting into the weeds, can you briefly kind of describe how you're accommodating that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And these are really high level slides, so I get it. We took those planning models. So we had the gas integrated resource plan optimization model that gave us an annual 20-year spend regarding pipeline contracts, storage, hydrogen, RNG, right, over time. The same thing is true on the electric portfolio. We have the electric optimization model. So that developed how much capacity did we need, how many renewable resources, how much were the thermals going to be running, and what was the fuel costs, right, incorporated as well as the electric price for the market, all those things. So all that is produced as well at an annual level for the 20-year time frame. And then we also had the electric transmission and distribution system run the same loads through to determine what would they need to build to accommodate those loads as well. And they got an annual spend and infrastructure build. And then the gas system planning did the same thing. So for the distribution and transmission gas system that PSE owns, how much fuel was being reduced and how would they see that system maybe peeling back a bit over time and those investments reducing. I guess I should have said on the electric portfolio, or I'm sorry, the gas portfolio, it reduced spend as well, right? So those were the two negative reductions, and then the electric side was the increases. So all of that flowed through, and then we essentially looked at the total capital O&M impact, and then inflated the revenue requirements and backed into these this bill analysis at a really high level.
That's a terrific explanation. Thank you. Thanks very much, Jennifer. And just to remind the group, we're talking about a snapshot in time, 1 year's cost in that year's dollars. So that's super helpful. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, of course. Does the heat pump conversion include the Climate Commitment Act costs associated with non-renewable generation? Yes, they all do. So CCA is included in the dispatch costs on the electric portfolio, if that answers your question. And oh, I think I just answered the second one too.
Yeah, I think you got them both.
Got them both. One answer. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next graph because it gets interesting. Maybe we'll see. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So this is the same exact visual. So I'm going to build it up the same way, but this is in 2045. So we're much later in the study period. And obviously a lot more of building electrification has occurred by this point in time. So you can see off the bat, you've got the electric bill, heating bill. So again, you'd have other things in your home, but if you're just focused on the average home for heating, this is what the bill may look like across those scenarios. So you got 1312 for that air source heat pump. On the gas side, this is where you start seeing the gas really start increasing. You're spreading the gas system costs over a smaller usage in some cases when you think of the hybrid heat pump cases on the further right of your side. But then on the left side, you're also reducing customers to spread those fixed costs over, right? On the far right, that's the reference case. So there's no electrification there. So you can see how that's is higher, but it's at $980. Then you have the Climate Commitment Act carbon costs on the gas bill. So this is the impact of that. And you can see if you're just looking at the energy, you would definitely be getting a price signal as a customer to convert from a gas furnace to an electric heat pump at that later point in time. And the reference case on the far right, you can see is a little bit higher as well. The furnace costs on top of that, as well as the heat pump costs, and then the total costs. And what this was interesting in the hybrid heat pump perspective, because in theory, the hybrid heat pump makes a lot of sense for a gas utility, right? You're reducing that peak need. But from a customer perspective, when you're looking at the all-in cost, because they have to buy the furnace and the heat pump, and you can see that's trying to be reflected in that third column there, you're still spending more than you would if you just purchased the standard heat pump, which was interesting. And we hadn't really thought of it that way previously. What's also interesting is that the reference case over here on the right is really close to the air source heat pump on the left. I think, there's a lot of, I don't know, the investment in the renewable infrastructure on the electric portfolio side is quite large and it's pretty costly. And there's a need to, get the renewable capacity resources there as well to ensure that the system is reliable and safe. And it's interesting that even in that scenario, you're spending just about the same in both of those versions, but you're not getting the same carbon reductions per se on the gas side. Any questions on this? Oh, and I guess on the cold climate heat pump, the kind of the intention of some of this work here is a lot more, obviously, than the air source heat pump. And what we found was those mild temperatures really didn't pay off from the energy use. So you got, I don't know, not even $300 difference in the electric bill between the two, but then that additional $1,000 for the equipment. So it doesn't really seem to pan out for customers in our area specifically, I guess, with the assumptions in this study. We looked at the same thing with low-income customers, and this was also interesting because there is a lot of push to, support low-income customers in this energy transition. And so we thought this was really helpful and interesting. So in the 2030 timeframe, these are the energy bills for a low-income customer that has either a gas furnace or has converted to that heat pump at that point in time in 2030. Again, they're all pretty similar, even in the reference case. You'll notice that The CCA is not here because they are supplemented on the CCA. And so once you add in the investments on those appliances, you're actually paying less on the gas side than you are on the electric. And so that was kind of that key takeaway about maybe converting them first, low income customers first, isn't maybe the best option depending on the customer over time based on the scenario. But what also stood out here is those hybrid heat pumps. Those options don't seem very cost effective in the low income bucket either.
So Jennifer, here on this slide, are you assuming, or does this assume that low income already has a gas furnace in it and you're replacing that at burnout?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're a homeowner and yeah, all those things.
Right.
And
Okay.
it adds in, those Inflation Reduction Act credits on the demand side. Those were really applied to those electric heat pumps for them, and they got substantially discounted in this version here too. So. Okay, so then this is same view, low income, 2045. So you can see that's again where we see those gas costs start really increasing because of the reduction of customers in the first couple of scenarios, but then the reduction of usage on the latter half there. And the reference case is on your far right. So in $2045, again, it's interesting. They're kind of close together. The hybrid heat pumps don't seem to pan out for them. But the other ones are all pretty close. You see the reference cases, the gas reference case is pretty low without the electrification.
So what's the impact? Kevin's asking the impact of the potential loss of IRA funds.
Yeah, well, I don't have that right now. That'd likely be incorporated into the ISP, but you could just expect this. I don't think you can see my mouse, but the teal equipment cost would increase for the electric heat pump for every scenario. So, because they were getting a substantial reduction on those investments.
Yeah. Like $8,000 or something like that, I think.
It's pretty big. Yeah, I actually have the table. Maybe after we're done, I can look it up real quick. But yeah. Okay, and then for some more sticker shock for you, this is looking at scenario 2, the cold climate heat pump. So the one that reduces the electric peak the most. So this was starting in 23, remember? So now, ironically, we're in 25. We'd have to convert 16,000 customers to the cold climate heat pumps. Oh, and I'll note, sorry, I meant to mention, this is all in terms of stipulation O, right? As I mentioned, there was 3 components, and one of them was the targeted electrification pilot. So that's why we say 13 pilots, and you're like, what's that mean? It essentially means 16,000 cold climate heat pumps. And I'm going to show you the roadmap to how you would achieve scenario 2 from an infrastructure perspective with this graphic. So we're starting off with converting those 16,000 customers. You're increasing your renewable utility scale renewable resources, 3.6 million megawatt hours. We need 570 megawatts of capacity and 2 additional transformers. When you get to 2030, you're bumping up pretty significantly to 122,000 customers. And this is where we see that regional transmission show up. So we got about 1,200 megawatts of generic cross cascades transmission. You can see that we're still adding a transformer a year. So we're at 9 by that point in time. And our capacity need goes up significantly to 2,800 megawatts. And as you go all the way across the screen until 2045, you can see that our regional transmission needs go up to 4,600 megawatts. We need 5,800 megawatts of capacity and 62 transformers and 117 miles of local transmission. So it's a pretty significant infrastructure build, even with the cold climate heat pump scenario, which has the least amount of peak reduction, or I'm sorry, the most peak reduction components because of that technology. So that's all I have. I have back to my key findings. Again, we're incorporating this and updating assumptions and making improvements as we embark on our first integrated system plan, which has different requirements based on HB 1589 of how we're evaluating the scenarios. So those are pretty different regarding how much building electrification would be assumed in each scenario. as well as the incorporation of varying electric vehicle forecasts and large data or large load interconnection requests, such as data centers. We're going to continue that targeted electrification pilot into phase 2 to get more learnings from that process. But across the board, the emission increases are higher in the near term, which is interesting. The costs are greater than the benefit to society. And the average residential customer really doesn't see much of a difference across the board because CETA is in there as well with those additional costs and that load growth across the region. Low-income customers, depending on their situation, transitioning them earlier in the process may not be the best. And then we do see benefits to targeted electrification in certain parts of the gas system, which would be continued to evaluate as we enter into this integrated system plan. Kind of mentioned the timing of that HB 1589 decarbonization bill was about halfway through our targeted electrification strategy. So a lot of that work really is being evaluated in our integrated system plan.
Jennifer, can you, I'm going to remind people that if you have questions for Jennifer, now's the time to type them into the chat. And I've got a couple ways to kind of dance while we let people type. But one question I have is, can you give us a little more on the targeted electrification? I mean, what's that look like? I don't need you to, I don't think you should identify specific areas you're looking at, but what does targeted electrification mean in this context? That'd be helpful, I think.
Yeah, for sure. PSE has been really focused on targeted electrification from a geographical location specific perspective. So evaluating areas of the gas system where we need to do some sort of investment, and depending on what that investment would cost and weighing that against electrifying those customers instead. That's kind of really a non-pipe alternative is kind of how we're viewing that. And it just has to pan out financially, but then also the customers have to agree to do it as well. And we haven't done any. So
yeah, I'm reminded of a Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, which I'm sure you're aware of their effort looking at the California State University of Monterey, which used to be a Navy base. So they had a feeder line that went into this community where there were like 400 or 500 housing units, I think, one landowner, one basically landlord, and a pipe feeding gas into that area that required some significant work. And they made this kind of calculation and they said, it would actually cost the customer less to electrify those 400 or 500 housing units than it would be to invest in upgrading the line. And they had agreement from the administration, the owner, the landlord, and then the administration of the university went through a change, and some of the residents pushed back. So you mentioned two parts, right? Where does it make sense economically? And can you get agreement from the end user? The second part was, originally they had a landlord that did agree, but they got pushback from some of their own residents. And the new administration said, no, never mind. And so it was kind of a unicorn opportunity. But I appreciate that you said. It has to be economic and there has to be agreement from the customer too. And that makes these things, hard to find, right? Those two things have to work together. So appreciate that. Well, I think what's in the chat is somebody saying they got to go. So I'm going to give you one more chance, folks, to ask questions in your chat. And when I do that, while you're typing those questions, I'm going to say, you know what? I was wrong. We do have an August webinar, so we're not giving you the summer break. And it's a good one, State of Play for Renewable Natural Gas and Natural Gas for Transportation by the Transport Project, which used to be called the Natural Gas Vehicles of America, now the Transport Project. And they'll be joining us on August 21st to provide some information about how renewable natural gas is working with natural gas transportation to help reduce emissions from the transportation sector, which in our state, our region, is the largest contributor to emissions by sector. And then we'll have an update on gas electric coordination work that the Northwest Gas Association is collaborating with PNUCC on September 18th. We'll have an update by the Northwest Coalition for Energy Choice on October 16th, and then in November, an industry perspective. So we've got a good lineup for you, and I encourage you to go to our website and look and sign up for those webinars that are most interesting to you. Tammy, with